Chapter 2. Daylight dwindled, but the deep-throated roar that was the voice of Dutch Springs grew as the sinking sun silhouetted the rugged Combrellas. The prairie grayed with the oncoming night, while Main Street blossomed with gaudy splendor. Glowing torches and smoking oil lamps reflected upon the dark features of sweating construction workers pouring up from the yard, eagerly seeking saloons and gambling tables after their day's work on the parched flats. Tents glowed like luminous balloons. The yapping of barkers and shouting of exuberant workers mingled with the tinny blare of music and strident laughter of women. Dutch Springs was warming up for a nightly spree. In his lean-to office back of the adobe jail, Pat leaned back in a creaky swivel chair and grinned at Sam's sadistic features. "Payday tomorrow," he announced ruefully. "And hell'll pop up aplenty in Dutch Springs," grunted his partner. "How many stiffs did they plant last payday? 6? Pat shrugged. "Maybe, but what's more or less when they're knocking 'em off every night? Well, it won't last forever, like Ezra says. The coyotes follow the payroll, and the payroll follows the steel. The track's snaking ahead right fast." He rose and tugged a shapeless Stinkin over his forehead. "Let's take a wander down to the yard. Pay train's due in pronto. Some gun-toting galoot might get some ideas." Side by side, they elbowed through the thronging Main Street and headed for the construction camp on the south end of town. The clamor was muted as they followed the curves of deep-rutted wagon road. Ahead, wavering lights pricked the night like swarming fireflies. Soon, they were threading between huge mess nets and storage sheds, ties stacked as high as the courthouse. Mules were tethered on long lines and wagons parked in endless rows and tents mushroomed by the score. Through all the seeming confusion ran the spur tracks, upon which engines snorted as tolling gangs loaded shining steel rail and fresh-cut ties upon long flat cars. This was the yard, the nerve center of construction, the workers' city. The pair reached the main track, gleaming steel on raw earth, laid straight as an arrow north and south. The brisk clatter of key rattling in a telegram shack. Nearby, sputtering torches illuminated the dun sides of a boxcar. Through the sliding doors, gaping wide open, Pat saw a fleshly man sitting with his chair tilted back, legs stretched over a flat-topped desk, chewing on a fat cigar. He wore a gray shirt and dark pants, and a gun was holstered about his waist. Pat mounted a short wooden stairway and entered the car. "Howdy, Sheriff." The thick-set man waved his cigar lazily. A shrill whistle echoed far off over the flats. "Here she comes, boys. You boys will be busy tomorrow." Mark Wisner, Chicago and Rio Grande paymaster, through his belly all bulged over, the broad cartridge belt buckled around his waist, had the reputation of being thoroughly competent, but his lips were too loose for the sheriff's liking. Talk was that he liked his women. Not that that amounted to much these days, Pat thought. A white light boomed far down the track, grew in intensity until an engine hissed to a stop opposite of the pay car. Behind it was hitched an express car and caboose. 2 armed men dropped out of the caboose, and the door of the express car rolled open. Bill North and an assistant, Colts bumping against their legs, emerged from the adjoining boxcar, and the transfer of the squat leather sacks of gold in which composed of the Chicago and Rio Grande payroll commenced. North and his helper toted the sacks to the paymaster. Wisner tallied them and dropped each sack with a metallic thud into a large iron safe behind the desk. Pat and Sam hunkered against the pay car. 2 guards, snorted Sam above the hissing of escaping steam. And they'd got a sack full of galoots around town who'll croak a guy for his boots. Someday they're going to be knocking that payroll off. Maybe it's best we just stick around, suggested Pat blandly. Finally, the express car was emptied. Pat tossed aside the butt of his cigarette and rose slowly and stretched. His ribs were still sore from the impact of construction boots. The engine shunted onto a siding. Wisner waved his hand from the pay car door with a shout of goodbye. Pat returned the salutation. "Be careful," he yelled. "That stuff's mighty dangerous company." Wisner chuckled. "I never take a chance." With both hands he slid the heavy armored door shut with a clang. It was midnight when the sheriff mounted the worn stair carpet of the Jewel Hotel. The hectic life of Dutch Springs was still in full blast, but Pat knew from dire experiences that he would not see his bed for 24 hours after the railway gold commenced circulating on the morrow. He sat on the battered iron bed and eyed the bare walls, straight-back chair, and picture-crowded washstand of the drab hotel room with a distaste. Quite a contrast to the cozy ranch house back in the foothills, he thought, with Sally, his golden-haired wife, serving up a tasty supper, and Doc, his striping son, currying his saddle horse. A feller didn't get much time to spare for home life these days. Sometime, maybe, when the steel was laid, things would quiet down. But Powder Valley, dang it, would never be the same again. He unbuckled his gun belt, and hung it on the bedpost, yanked off his boots, and pitched them into a corner. "Sheriff! Hey, Sheriff!" The shouting refrain awoke Pat. Someone was racing up and down the passage outside, yelling frantically. Pat stirred, snapped wide awake, and abruptly sat up in bed. The first gray light of dawn was coming through the open window. The clamor outside, plain though the flimsy plank partitions, were disturbing sleepers down the entire rows of rooms. Sleepy growls, mumbling threats, and irate curses arose in angry chorus from the rudely awakened guests. Pat slid out of the sheets and hastily put on his pants and padded to the door in his socks. A harried-looking man in shirt-sleeves and eye-shade pushed up on his forehead was frenziedly pounding on doors, ignoring the storm of explicitives that were exploding in his ears. "I'm the sheriff," bawled Pat. "What's wrong?" "You're wanted down at the yard quick," the man gasped. "Paymaster's dead and the payroll's been looted." "Get inside," invited Pat briskly. The messenger followed him into the room and flopped wearily onto the bed. "Who are you?" questioned the sheriff, tugging on his boots. "I'm the telegraph operator. I run graveyard shift. Stanton's the name." "When did you get wise to Wisner's killing?" "Oh, not 30 minutes back. A rush come through from Chicago. I toted it down to his headquarters and right next to the pay car. The pay car door wasn't closed tightly, and I knew the payroll was checked in last night, so I took a look-see." He shuddered. "And there was Wisner. There was blood all over his shirt and the safe wide open." "When did you go on duty?" Pat buckled on his gun belt. "Midnight." "Everything honky-dory then?" "I can't say, Sheriff. I had no reason to look." "Anyone around when you found him?" "No. I hot-footed it for you after." Pat grunted approval and slammed on his Stinson. "Well, let's go." The two ran down the stairs and hurried across the hotel lobby. Every leather rocker lined along the walls held a sleeping man. The shirted fronts and forms of Weary construction workers sprawled on the bare boards of the floor, one stretched out along the cigar counter. Outside in the chill dawn, light and quiet had at last finally descended upon Dutch Springs. The flaming torches had gutted out, tents gleamed like spectacles on a half-light. Drunks dotted the plank walk, and one or two real men roamed aimlessly through the dust of the street. Before one clapboard saloon, a body was jackknifed over a hitching rail, arms dangling. In the telegraph shack, the key was clattering away insistently when they hit the railroad bed. Pat's companion scurried over to his instrument while the sheriff headed for the pay car. Down the track, freight cars chromed and crashed, shuttled by a snorting engine. There was no sign of life around the boxcar that housed Wisner's two assistants. The heavy door of the pay car gaped open. Pat ran up the wooden steps and came to a quick stop as he caught sight of the paymaster's body slumped in a swivel chair behind his flat-top desk. Wisner's head dropped upon his chest, bedded upon a fleshly chin. Irregular rust-like stains marred the front of his gray shirt. His arms hung limp. Pat gently unrolled the stained shirt and eased it open. The rolls of fat on Wisner's chest were caked with congealed blood. A puckered hole over the heart told the story. The sheriff touched the dead man's head, and it was cold and stiff. The arms were like ramrods. Carefully, he withdrew Wisner's gun from the dangling holster and broke it and examined the loads. It had not been fired. Replacing the weapon, Pat turned to the safe. The massive door was swung wide open, and a bunch of keys hung from the keyhole. A few account books lay on the top shelf, but the stacks of gold had disappeared. Lips pursed, the sheriff stood back, eyes searching the office. Nothing else seemed to be out of place. The story seemed plain. The killer, had surprised Wisner at his desk and shot him, and took his keys and opened the safe and fled with the Chicago Rio Grande payroll. Curiously, Pat examined the walls of the plainly furnished office. The whole car was a huge safe. Overlapping sheets of iron were bolted to the sides and ceilings like the scales of a fish. Even the sliding door that provided the only exit was armored. If the door had been secured, nothing less than a charge of gunpowder would have forced entry. Had it been secured, 2 large bolts were screwed to the inside. A quick inspection showed that they weren't forced. On the outside of the door, a heavy padlock open hung from its hasp. Had Wisner shot the bolt when he clanged the door shut after the gold had been unloaded? If so, and he opened the door to admit the killer, why had he not been shot in his tracks instead of at the desk? Why hadn't he gone for his gun? Maybe, mused Pat, he had neglected to bolt the door, and the killer had eased it open a few inches and shot him from the outside. The sheriff stepped outside and slid the door shut with considerable effort, and then endeavored to ease it open inch by inch, as the killer might have done. The dusty wheels on the guide rail upon which the door had hung squeaked dismally. Wet with sweat from his effort, Pat persisted, and then gave up and forgot his theory of shooting from the doorway. It was bright daylight now, and the yard pulsated with activity. Black smoke from belching locomotives stained the clear air. A string of flat cars clanged past, stacked high with ties and steel. Upon the track, hostlers were tossing hay into the mule lines. Construction laborers swarmed around the tent dormitories, eager for the pay call. Only the most essential work would be done today, and the labor bosses would have trouble aplenty rounding up hands to do that, for payday was layoff day. A painful surprise was in store for those Jaspers, thought the sheriff. At any rate, there'd be less killings in Dutch Springs when night loosened the devil's cavalry upon town. 2 other boxcars stood on the spur track below the pay office. The first, Pat thought, was the murdered man's living quarters, and the second housed the 2 assistant paymasters. He knuckled the door of the assistant's car. Bill North, bare to the waist, razor in one hand and chin lathered, slid it open. "Morning, Sheriff," he grinned. "All set for a heavy day? Better get some rubber walls on that dinky jail." And then, observing the somber set of Pat's features, he dropped his battering and bantering tone. "There been trouble?" he queried. "Plenty of trouble." Pat's voice was curt. "You stick around last night?" "I never left my quarters after we checked that payroll." "Hear any noise? A gun, for instance?" "There's plenty of noise around the yard at night, Sheriff. They load the cars after sunset. Yard men are switching and making up trains all night. You wouldn't notice a battery of artillery firing shots." "So," Pat scratched his ear. "You see Wisner after I pulled out?" "No, the old man bolted himself into the pay car. He usually makes a final check-up and timesheets, the night before we pay out." "Are you plumb certain he bolted himself in?" "Well, I didn't exactly see him, but he always does," returned North a little lamely. "If and so, he opened up again. He was plugged, and the payroll took." "Who killed him?" "You tell me," replied the sheriff tensely. "There'll be hell to pay. The road figures a few laborers will curl up, but plugging a paymaster and lifting a hunk of railroad cash is something different." A thought struck him. "Say, mosey on down to Doc Trimble's. Tell him he's wanted urgently, and don't be spreading the news yet." Without further word, the young assistant paymaster reached for a towel, wiped the soap off his face, and slipped on a shirt. "Hey!" barked Pat as North ran down the steps. "You forgot your iron." He nodded towards a gun belt that was hanging over a peg. North smiled. "I never carry a gun, Sheriff, except on duty. Mine's probably choked with dust. Never pressed the trigger since it was issued." The sheriff nodded, watched North's tall form swing out of sight along the tracks, and then slipped inside and swiftly scrutinized the interior of the car. The 2 bunks were built across the far end. In one, the blankets were tumbled, but the other was neatly made up. A small table and chairs were set in the center. Articles of clothing were suspended from hooks along the side. Several valises were stacked in a corner. At the other end of the car stood a pot-belly iron stove. Pat tested the top of it with his hand. It was cold. He lifted the lid, ignited the stinker, and peered inside. The stove was a quarter full of wood ashes. Next, the sheriff rolled up his sleeves and explored the inside of the stovepipe, and was rewarded by no more than a sooty arm. He turned to the assortment of clothes and attentively fingered clothes and shirt pants, and then he snapped open the holster flap of North's gun and lifted out the heavy Colt. The appearance of the weapon verified North's words. Dust lay heavy on the butt and cylinder. Pat pressed the release key and the cylinder dropped into his hand. It was empty. The sheriff smiled absently. North evidently relied upon his hard fist if trouble cropped up. He sniffed the barrel, replaced the cylinder, and slid the pin home. Further search yielded nothing. Pat was not surprised. He had not expected to find anything but a murder case a man can never afford to overlook a bet. "Well, now for a look-see in Wisner's den," he murmured. "Reckon I got time before the doc gets here." The door of the paymaster's car was ajar. Pat's eyebrows lifted when he studied inside, and his estimate of the dead man's character subtly changed. Compared with his subordinates, Wisner was living in luxury, sensual luxury that the sheriff found nauseating. A heavy brass bed with white sheets and a silk spread stood on one end, partly screened by a flowering curtain that was hanging from a crosswire. The floor was covered with a thick rug, centered by a circular mahogany table upon which stood a table that was bowled with glass and a box of cigars. Two comfortable rockers, upholstered in brown leather, flanked the table. The walls of the car had been painted a soft cream, and upon them was pinned a collection of nudes that Pat thought and discussed would put the rankest joint in Dutch Springs to shame. Here was an aspect of Wisner's character he had never suspected. Voices, down track, pulled him to the door. Tubby, red-faced, Doc Trimble, squinted fiercely through thick lens spectacles and toted his inevitable black bag, stepped briskly over the ties beside North's big, easy-gaited figure. At sight of the sheriff, the doc emitted a disgusted snort. "Homicide, homicide, that's all I hear. Morning, noon, and night. Won't I ever have another case of a good old-fashioned measles? Well, where's the cadaver?" "Right here, Doc." Pat led the way into the car, the little doctor at his heels. Bill North headed for his quarters. Doc Trimble took one look at the crumpled figure and dropped his bag on the carpet. The little medico and Pat had worked together on cases for many years, and the sheriff knew his irritability was a thin veneer that covered a warm heart and a sound medical knowledge. "Well, what do you want to know? The cause of death?" snorted Trimble, indicating the bullet hole with a stubby forefinger. "Nope, even a dumb sheriff could figure that out," smiled Pat. "Just tell me how long that Jasper's been dead." Trimble rounded the desk and bent and examined the wounds closely. Then he fingered the dead paymaster's stiffened arms and working downward, endeavoring to flex the cramped legs. Finally he straightened and flicked out a white handkerchief and vigorously polished his glasses. "Well, Doc," drawled Pat. "About 8 hours, 10 on the outside. Rigor mortis is complete." "That would place the killing somewhere around midnight. Thanks, Doc." "Ah, damn it," ejected the sheriff as Trimble's round figure disappeared around the end of the car. "I plumb overlooked Wisner's other assistant. Wonder how come he's not around." End of chapter 2.